If you can look at something and if you can just spot what would make it better and then articulate it, then you've got this Steve Jobs power of cutting through the noise and figuring out the one thing that really matters. Hey, welcome back to Three Bosses Walk Into a Room and Nothing Gets Done. We've had this topic rolling around for a while now, and I'm excited to explore it. First, tell me, what do you see as the difference between derivative work or like iterative improvements? And what would you consider to be genuine innovation? And then why does it feel like big companies often stop innovating?
It's such an interesting question because sometimes doing work that starts out as derivative and then moves into iteration can leap into innovation.
Yeah.
Like I think you can start by copying an existing service or product and be like, okay, there's this service or product out there. I feel passionate about it, but I want to make it better. So that's derivative. You're like, all right, I'm just going to start by competing. I'm going to replicate that service or product. I want to be at least as good as what they have.
For sure.
And then see what happens next. You go out there and you do it.
This is kind of the yes and mindset.
Yeah. And then along the way, as you're building this thing, you learn a ton, of course. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is really hard. And no wonder why I was dissatisfied on the user end because it's so hard and costly and people keep quitting and no one likes to work in this industry or whatever it is, right?
Awful.
And then you get to iterative improvement. You're like, all right, I'm going to put some elbow grease into this and I'm going to make it slightly better. It's not going to be a huge leap, but it's just going to be slightly better. Maybe it's more efficient. Maybe it delivers a little bit higher quality. Maybe you can deliver results in a slightly faster amount of time. Or maybe you can just deliver the same product, but with better customer service.
Sure.
Sometimes that's what people do. So who knows what it is?
That makes a huge difference a lot of times.
Right.
This is maybe something that I hear a lot of people being critical of Apple over. People will say, well, Apple's not really an innovator. They're not really creative. They just take other ideas and package them nicely. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, yeah, nice packaging makes a difference in how people feel about the product.
Right.
Clearly, it was a good idea. It was a useful service or it was a useful experience.
Right.
But if you're super fixated on making the one feature or the one aspect of it that's like, this is a problem I want to solve, and you don't round out the corners and try and make it friendly to sign up or more approachable for people who don't really understand the space.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be Apple. Literally, any company who comes in and does the same thing as you, all they have to do is copy your work, but then they get to focus on the thing that bothers them.
Exactly.
Which is how nice it is to start using the product or how friendly the support is.
Yeah. So I think that's where I see derivative and iterative work leap into innovation is when you've earned the insight that no one else has had yet.
Totally.
I'm not like a worshiper or like a fanboy, but I do think having read a couple biographies of Steve Jobs, he did have these moments in his life. It felt like he could just enter a new industry and make improvements right at the beginning because he was just such a like first principles thinker and he was super opinionated about how shitty most products are. So I do think he's someone who's rare who like doesn't even need to do a lot of the grunt work to get to the insight that leads to a huge improvement that no one else had tried before.
It's funny with him in particular. I don't know anything except what I've heard, but for me as a designer, I kind of idolize what I saw as his clear-headed ability to kind of cut through the nonsense, identify the real problem and articulate it. And then being in a position of power to actually just tell somebody to fix this thing. And that made it substantially better.
Right.
It felt like the most enviable position for somebody who is constantly caught up in red tape or trying to persuade one person after the next to just be able to look and say, this is the issue, fix this or we're not releasing it. Then I can definitely see how you could get into a position where you're seen as a bully. But if you're right, it's hard to argue.
Right.
From my own experience as a designer, what I feel like is despite his reputation, he probably had just an incredible degree of empathy. And that doesn't mean that he was kind or he used it to like soften the way that he expressed himself, but to be able to examine his own kind of emotional reaction or what he understood other people's reactions would be, and to be able to articulate that and specify what change you could make to generate a different reaction.
Right.
I have a lot of people ask me like, okay, well, what is this? What is UX? I try and describe it as the intersection of design and psychology, where for me, design is problem solving. But I think for most people, design is more art. It's more about like, what do the buttons look like? What colors did you choose? How does the logo make you feel? But there is that middle point where you're not looking at just, are the colors satisfying? Are the shapes satisfying? But like, what meaning do you derive from it?
Right.
And is that a universal thing? Or is it something that is really particular to you? And if it is a universal thing, is it human nature? Or is it just that we've gotten to this homogenous culture?
Right.
And maybe it doesn't matter that level of distinction, but if you can look at something and just see like what would make it better, and if you can just spot that and then articulate it, then you've got this Steve Jobs power of cutting through the noise and figuring out the one thing that really matters.
Right. As to your second question, I've been reading this book. Apparently, I'm like the last person in the world to read it. Everyone has already read it, but I've been reading Marty Kagan's book called Inspired.
Oh, yeah.
It's really good, but it has a better answer than I could articulate for why enterprises stop innovating. And like, this is part of the genius of the book. So some of the chapters in this book are basically 1 page long. And I think that's brilliant, right?
Oh, crazy.
Like it motivates the reader. It's like, here, you can get through a chapter today. It's 1 page.
Really setting the bar low so you can feel accomplished.
Yeah. And it keeps me motivated. So yeah, it's like enterprise companies have already embarked on a slow death spiral. They become all about leveraging the value and the brand that was created many years or even decades earlier. The death of an enterprise company rarely happens overnight, and a large company can stay afloat for many years, but make no mistake about it, the organization is sinking, and the end is all but certain. It's not intentional, but once companies reach this size, often becoming a publicly traded company, there are a tremendous number of stakeholders throughout the business working hard to protect what they've already created. Unfortunately, this often means shutting down new initiatives or ventures that could recreate the business. Or putting up so many obstacles to new ideas that few people are willing or able to drive the company in a new direction. There's a little bit more to this chapter, but like that says it better than I could. That sums up my experiences at enterprise companies for sure.
I definitely can relate to that, and I feel like it very much describes my own experiences also. But I feel like there's maybe more that we can dive into about the human equation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, every individual person, I think, is incentivized at either a financial level or from a job satisfaction level because they're going to be doing something more interesting, or even in customer service. You're incentivized to make the product better because you're going to have to deal with fewer complaints and unhappy customers who you have to fix the problems for. Like, ultimately, the less work we can do and the less we have to do kind of unpleasant chores, the more satisfaction we're going to derive.
Right.
And so we all have, I think, this incentive to try and make things better. And yet, apparently counter to that, there are so many people in any sort of corporation or hierarchy of management who will apparently do anything in their power to stop you from innovating. Mm-hmm. Like, what is it that particularly drives that resistance to trying something new, changing? Is it fear of failure? It seems to me like that could be mitigated, at least to some extent, with reduced investment.
Yeah, there's a lot. I've seen a lot of different things. One of them is like what I call like silos and silo culture. I mean, that's what everyone calls it, where you have these sub companies within a company. You have these like tiny orgs, right, that with little leaders on a hill who have their own little hierarchy and power structure. And it's kind of a zero-sum game. Like, if you get headcount, right, if you get to hire more employees, then that's headcount that they didn't get that year. So your success is their failure to some extent. So, they're protecting their org.
It's interesting the kind of culture war that produces.
Yeah, that no one trusts anyone. Information doesn't move between silos. If they don't grow next year, then that means they're on the chopping block, So when they see you succeed, they see themselves failing. And that's the kind of stakes, that's the game that gets played. And sometimes I've seen management even encourage, like, yeah, you two should fight because it's going to make one of you better, and then I'm going to chop the other one.
Awful. So
that's good for the company, but it's not actually. It creates a really bad resistance, like you said.
Yeah.
The other thing I notice is anytime someone does something new, it's perceived as more work for everyone else.
Totally.
So better to just stay put, don't rock the boat, leave things as they are, don't take risks. There's probably historical reasons for that within the company, why this sort of malaise sets in. But that's another thing that I've seen on the ground.
What you're saying about the rivalries that might even be encouraged by leadership within an organization, thinking like, whichever one succeeds, we're going to grow you and we can cut costs on the other side. Mm-hmm. I can see the reasoning. Like if it's just business, and yeah, you're going to invest in the thing that makes you money. But it's funny because it feels so counter to at least what I understand of the business culture from like the 80s, for instance, which, did you ever see the movie Office Space?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, so this is a movie from the late 90s or something, and I haven't seen it in a long time, but I feel like this is kind of a film that was a reaction to a lot of work culture, essentially. And if I remember correctly, the drum that management was beating was synergy. You know, we're going to combine the efforts of different organizations. And I feel like when you look at business acquisitions, the thing that is pointed to is, yeah, we're going to get this synergy where one set of accountants and one set of HR and one set of these kind of universal business organizations can support more product teams, or they can support more groups. And so when you have business acquisition, then you have layoffs of those quote unquote redundant departments, or some people get to keep their jobs, but some people don't, because you have teams that can just do more with the same resources. And that becomes your quote unquote synergy. And when you look at it, not from an organizational level of like the HR department can support any number of teams, or the accounting department can, you know, they've set up accounting for your salaries and your whatever, and they're filing all of the reports. So what's the difference between 200 employees and 300 employees, or 20,000 and 30,000? Like, I think that makes sense. But then when you look at it from, I have two product teams,
right,
and I'm going to incentivize them to be rivals, like, now they're not sharing work. They're anti-synergy. They're incentivized to actually not rely on each other and build their own things, because,
right,
you know, even if they're friends or they wanted to work together, that other team might not exist in 6 months or a year. And if those people are gone and they wrote that software or the documentation, the knowledge disappears, you can't count on it anymore. And do you want to maintain something that
right,
you don't know how it works? Like,
right,
that just sets you behind.
Yeah. No, you're right about that. I've definitely seen that for sure.
So I guess the question we're left with is, having identified these issues, what can we do to change this? Is it possible for us to proactively seek out other teams and find ways of collaborating despite the management's apparent desire to incentivize the opposite?
Yeah, seems like short of leadership changing their approaches to motivating, it's going to take something more, right? Something's got to give, or competition from smaller, more focused organizations will eventually replace the incumbents, and then the cycle repeats.
We can definitely come back to this topic in the future to discuss how companies can remain innovative by taking risks. It's also important to identify the right risks to take. As always, it's critical to answer questions like, who wants this feature? Why do they want this? And is there something more important we could be doing for them instead?
Definitely. That should be a fun topic to explore. Until next time, be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with us. Consider leaving a like or sharing with friends, and we'll catch you all in the next episode of Boss Radio.